Is it correct to say that so-called God, or the source as you call it, is in the highest dimension?
It is one dimension. It could be considered the 13th dimension. From what we interpret as such, different entities, different races, different species can interpret dimensionality differently than we do, how we interpret them, how we define them, how we categorize them. In a sense, is that at the 13th level would be what you consider God, but it's not a person that exists in this frequency. It's that the entire dimension itself is this source of energy, which however also is a result and combination of all other dimensions into one. That's also the reason the numbers 12 and 13 played a large role in one of your numerology.
I see. Are there multiple gods or sources, each with their own multiverse to your knowledge?
The term God have been used differently on your world. Very often for extraterrestrial, what you consider visitors or star systems even. Beings from star systems individually or entire groups or collectives. But when you ask what the one God is, you know it from your so-called monotheist idea. It's a frequency. It's something entirely different. And that's one thing that exists and encompasses everything. Nothing can be outside of it. Even its own polar opposite. It's perhaps a philosophical question, interpretation, analysis. While those other beings you have considered gods numerously on your world are just terms for visitors, or sometimes for the star system those visitors came from.
What I'm kind of asking though is, like, you said that the source is the 13th dimension. I mean, like, is there just one source, or like, is it possible for there to be like multiple different sources that each have their own lower dimensions?
From what we interpret as the 13th dimension, it's a combination of all other dimensions into one. So if you would take in the structure of a dimensional construct, that would be a combination of all dimensions into one dimension that you can consider the source of everything. And then you would take another one that's another source of everything that's next to the one, that everything would not be everything. Everything would be nothing, because nothing would be the opposite of everything. But since everything cannot be nothing, this nothingness, it's very complicated to explain this in your English language, as you realize. If you take this as an interpretation in your universe, then in the parallel universe, you could get a different combination of dimensionalities, and then a different interpretation of the 13th dimension in the parallel universe could be considered a different type of source. It's of course still the same, but because you see it from a different angle, it can appear something different. But it only appears as something different because it's being looked at from a different angle. If you're aware of your quantum physics, where your scientists slowly get a hang of this, as you call it such, those interpretations alter the event. The way you look at it makes the thing you look at it be different. Therefore, from such an angle, you could consider, but only from this interpretation, that there could be a parallel universe in which a different 13th dimension, therefore a different source exists. But that's just a view from what you consider a lower dimension, because if you are at the higher dimension, and remember, we are also not exactly at the 13th dimension, we also make it our level up, our traveling up the levels. So from where we are currently at, the way we can interpret it is there's only one that encompasses all of those, but beings that are in what you consider a higher dimension might have a completely different outlook, but the different outlook likely only exists because of the viewpoint that they're having, which then creates a different experience that you can consider a different source and therefore a god, or an entirely different universe that exists, but that's something to be looked at from outside this universe that you're in. Or as you have a saying in your world, you don't see the forest for the trees.
Right. I think I understand a little bit what you're saying. It's still a little confusing, but I think I understand a little bit of it. Now, can you
You can reach
can
those states in meditation, and then you can also see those things in your third eye, but perhaps makes it easier understandable by you listening to this.
okay. Uh, Now, can you please explain how the fourth dimension is different from the third dimension?
First and foremost, the difference between intention and creation is easier, the shorter, the time is shorter, and therefore the creation happens much from your experience, from how way you view time faster, because your malleability of time becomes more obvious to you. Furthermore, things are more fluid. Your feeling center would react differently from what we have studied in your kind, because many of you fluctuate between the third and the fourth back and forth. Therefore, you might feel what you consider better, but not in the sense that you have joy and happiness, like when you're at the party and you're jumping around, as some of you people do, which is very strange. However, the idea is more you're having more serene understanding. There's not so much confusion anymore that you currently find so struggling, so difficult in lower dimensions. One example for this to be easily understood, perhaps something to relate to your conscious mind further, is your dream state. When you're in your dream state, you're very often in what you consider the fourth dimension. You can experience lucid dreaming, as you call it, such to get a hang of it, to practice. In terms of how the malleability works. When you experience perhaps in lucid dreaming or what you consider astral traveling, you think of something, and then you can twist your way around and you create a different reality around it. You in one house, for example, in your dream state, and you wish to be in a different house. Let's say you want to travel from a hut to a palace. You don't need to walk out the door and walk into the palace. You just need to think of certain things, and you can then shift over there more easily. It doesn't necessarily happen in the fourth dimension that you can. It won't be experienced that way from your conscious mind when you're there, but that's how it works. You can then get in a different state that immediately gives you more access to more options than you would have in the third. That's the best way I can describe it with the primitive language that I have to use.
I think I understand the basic concept. Okay, now, do you know what human ghosts are? In other words, people that have died but can sometimes be seen as apparitions and sometimes be heard on electronic devices. I mean, are they in another dimension or something?
Yes.
Is it the fourth dimension?
Yes. No surprise you're asking this question in conjunction. The poltergeist manifestations, for example, come from beings that are stuck there and not quite sure what's happening.
So, like, when people die, is, like, what happens to us? Does our soul go to the fourth dimension until we reincarnate into the third dimension?
You are your soul, in a sense, so yes, you simply go to what you consider the fourth dimension until you reincarnate in the third, unless, of course, you manage to permanently stay in the fourth. Also, and then you can reincarnate in the fourth. But once you reach that level, your incarnation, your leaving of your what you consider a more conscious life, will be then the fifth. But in general, you spend more time, from your understanding where you are now in the third, in between lives than you are spending them in the physical form. Or from our perspective, from a higher dimensional perspective in general, you're simply at a more conscious experience of frequency in what you consider a higher dimension, therefore this being more what you consider time. Only a minute fraction of your existence is spent incarnated in a lower dimension in what you consider the third dimensional form. The planning of a lifetime takes much longer from your experience of time than the actual lifetime.
Very interesting. Now, can you please explain how the first and second dimensions are different from the third?
In a similar fashion, it is so different from the fourth. There's even less consciousness, less malleability. From what you have termed the chakra system, which is a very primitive interpretation of your energetic field, it can be easily related the chakras to the dimensionality. In other words, the first dimension is very much connected to what you consider your root chakra, not necessarily the part in your body it relies to the particular frequencies, but the ideas and concepts you from your interpretation of the line with it, which is simply existence. First dimension is all about existence, you just exist. You're not fully aware of your existence or in a conscious sense, but that's the main thing. Existence, you survive. The main concern is to just exist. That's all. That's all you're capable of, is to just exist. The basic most important function. In other words, if you take that into consideration, you also realize how important it is to be grounded. Because otherwise you can't exist. That's how it works. The second then is about the idea of exploration in a more, not just sensual, sexual senses, what you first and foremost associate with the second chakra, but in general about the emotional state of just feeling. Not necessarily in the heart-based center of what you consider feeling, what we're quite analyzing still, but more in the sense of just perceiving, such as when you're putting your hand on a stove and you realize it's hot, that type of feeling. It's mostly about experiencing life from a feeling sense, just realizing like a child. Like one of your young children just grows up and realizes that certain foods taste a certain way, etc. If you're familiar with what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I think I understand.
Just experiencing life from a sense of enjoying the pleasures of being a person, being an individual, not just existing, but enjoying certain things and being displeased about other things. Experiencing the basic, what you consider emotionality. Also being able to create a certain sense, have a certain level of creativity, of functioning, not just existing, but acting, doing. But there's no full consciousness, so full self-consciousness. For example, if you take a more primitive animal, like those that you eat, and compare them with your own consciousness, you realize there's a difference. Or the dolphins, for example, that also have a higher consciousness, there's a difference between them and beings that are just living their life for the idea of having this sort of pleasure and less pain. There's a difference in having a consciousness of yourself, being aware of yourself, having even what you consider an ego is already the evolution at that stage, the highest you can achieve really. To be fully conscious of who and what you are as a being self-conscious as you call this. Perhaps a teenager level in your evolution as a person, if I'm relating this back to what I previously mentioned as a childhood.
Right.
You know, the last time we were talking about dimensions, and we kind of ran out of time, but like I did want to pick up where we left off. We talked last time about the lower 4 dimensions. Can you please tell me how the 5th dimension is different from the rest?
From which one other in particular?
All of them, basically. I mean, how is it different from the 4th? Let's put it that way.
It's less dense. It's perhaps comparable best to your internet. It's mostly about information and communication. A lot of your dimensionality and density idea can also be referred to as a state of consciousness. The more aware you are, the higher you are in consciousness, and therefore also in such a frequency range that you can then term with numbers. It's mostly about communication, and it's mostly about information. It is difficult to relate those concepts in a language of a people that has been developed in the third. When you transition to higher dimensions, you will realize that your language will also shift entirely. For example, your Egyptian hieroglyphs also come from a higher density than your current Latin alphabet. However, it is more than likely you will find one world global language in your near future, likely a version of English that's modified, not what you're using now. For example, when you communicate using the internet, correct? You're also often using sign language, not just written words, correct?
Right, correct.
That's likely how your language will also change. That then will be easier to relate this information to you, rather than when I'm trying to use words, speaking through this person with vocal cords using those words. Mostly, your internet is the best reference point I can give to you what the 5th dimension is. Sometimes you already are in the 5th dimension yourself when you are tuned in the consciousness grid of your entire planet at that level that everything else is usually connected. Like, for example, the internet is a primitive version of, like the Akashic Chronic, for example, right?
Right, okay.
Your
Okay.
sense will also be different. As you heard previously, we are both geeks, right? That's the word,
Right.
right. In these terms, you will sense things differently. Not just intellectual information might be difficult to comprehend for a geek myself.
Okay,
But your sensing will be different. Everything around you will appear differently. Not like it will have different colors or anything. Your perception will be different, but not like you are an hallucinogenic substance or something like this. It's more like you are more fine-tuned.
Right. So how is the sixth dimension different from, say, the fifth dimension?
What I'm aware of, that's when you will have comprehension, not just communication, knowledge. Ideas are usually connected from your current idea to the sixth sense, right?
Oh, okay.
So the ideas, you will likely at that stage all be what you consider telepathic. You'll be able to use telekinesis, etc. From what I understand.
Cool.
You will be able
Okay.
to levitate. Those things are malleable examples I can give you. Other things are difficult for me to explain, but those are things that you have at least have a concept of that will be normal at that state. Common. That's the term. Common. But
Right.
you will also have to alter a lot of things in your society before you get there.
Right. Okay, well, you don't have to be a mind reader to guess my next question. How are the seventh, the eighth, and the ninth dimensions and so on different?
That's not something I'm fully aware of myself, but they're in the non-physical states, yes.
Okay.
So it's very likely that they are in connectivity with the entire universe really much greater, the understanding how everything works, so to speak. The differences between different species, for example, will likely be not important because you're not in the physical form anymore. But that's just how I can judge things, reading information that we were also given from higher evolved species. Not something I can talk about from my personal experience. Anyway.
What dimension are you in? Is it the fifth one?
Yes.
Okay. Cool. Now, another question I have. I often hear phrases like third density or fourth density. Is density just another word for dimension, or are they two separate things?
From my understanding, two separate things. The way they're perceived in your world, at least. Density is more rate to your own frequency you have, from which you can then move to different dimensions, but that's also where I can only read information that's stored in database and related to you. As we are both moving through dimensionality and different densities anyway.
Right. Okay. Now, I have two pet cats and a pet rat. Can you say what dimension they're in?
Likely the cat is likely, one of them seems to be in the fourth, which is very unusual. And many times fluctuating between the third and the fourth, similar to your own species. The other one seems to be the third. And the rat in the second.
Okay, cool. Now, it's weird how you describe it, how you describe like lower dimensions. Like, I think when most people in our world think of the idea of dimensions, they picture it where it works like you can't see or interact with someone in another dimension. But I mean, obviously, I can see and interact with my pets. So why can we usually only see and hear ghosts in the fourth dimension for a few seconds at a time before they suddenly vanish and we can't really interact with them so well?
Even the trees and your plants, to a large degree, are in the second dimension. You can interact with them, they can interact with you. But they might perceive you much differently than you perceive them.
Right.
And
so,
you
like,
can definitely also refer to beings in a higher dimension or density. They are not invisible to you. It just depends on your own perception. They could become more visible. Many of them just chose not to appear as clear to you. They could if they wished to. From what I understand. Just like I could appear in your living room and disappear again. But I could also choose to remain physical, just like you, and touch you with my hand. And you could touch me. You wouldn't creep through me.
Right. Like, for example, a lot of times whenever people use electronic devices, like radios, they can sometimes talk to spirits in the fourth dimension, but usually like they only come through for like 1 or 2 seconds at a time. Do you know why we can't communicate with them constantly?
Choice.
Their choice?
Their choice. They could certainly direct both. Human extraterrestrials have also used those technological means to talk to people on Earth numerous times. Both television as well as radio, most particularly. Especially because before the advent of your internets, but yes, happened for a longer period of time if there was an agreement between the individual.
Cool.
Just as possible as telepathy.
Cool. Very interesting. Well, a final question that I have on dimensionality. I always hear this idea of ascension, that the human collective is currently in a process of transitioning from the third to the fourth dimension. Is this true?
Many of you are already there, at the fourth. You just don't realize it. You spend a lot of time there. You're fluctuating. Again, your sensing is different, of course. You feel perhaps more connected, more heart open.
So, like, why are we sometimes in the fourth and other times we're only in the third? Is there something that we do to bring us to the fourth?
Yes, from what I understand, you open your heart further, and you're more in the moment. The third dimension, from what I understand, it's more about your ego personality, not about connection to others. And with others, I'm speaking generally.
Right.
The more you're connected doesn't mean you to write a nice letter to your mom. The more you're connected to everybody, sensing, the more you're in the force. The more you identify with your pure ego desire, whether it was positive or negative, the more you're in the third. It's typical for the third. Just like survival is typical for the first, or sensuality and physical pleasure is typical for the second.
Right. So, are you able to sort of look into our future a little bit and make a prediction when you think we're all as a collective going to enter the fourth dimension?
Unlikely, as there's numerous possibilities. Also,
right.
You will enter the force, and then you will be part of the collective that's already there. You don't have to wait for the collective. The collective is just giving you a reflection of where you're currently at. If you're reading the news, for example, and there's what you consider terror or war, then it's likely you're currently at a frequency that's not susceptible for the fourth dimension. Not like there are no conflict in the fourth dimension, but the way you're conducting conflict on your third dimension on Earth is your current learning lesson. Once you move beyond that, then you'll be ready for something more. You can also sense this from your own, you can gauge this from your own feeling state. That's what I understand feeling is good for, anyway.
Right. Okay, cool. Well, very, very interesting. That's all the questions that I have.
You don't necessarily ascend as a species, you just tune to the version that's already there. Keep that in mind.
Okay. Cool.